played a vital role in one way or another. You must have always heard the term NATO from your newspapers, magazines, or anywhere. So, what is NATO? NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as the largest military organization in the world. Did you know about any organization which plays an important role in most of the important decisions taken at the international level? Yes, that is NATO. The ideologies of NATO may influence many decisions at the international level today. If we take a look at our present world or our recent history, NATO has played a vital role in one way or another in every significant event of the world, whether it is the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022 or the Korean War in 1950. The reason may be good or bad, but NATO is always in the news for some reason or the other. After the Second World War, the old superpowers like France, England, Italy, and Germany were weakened. On the other hand, the new superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, took the throne in their place. The Second World War ruined the complete political and economic system all over the world, which needed to be rebuilt. So, the conflict arises between America and the Soviet Union. But why? Because they have to prepare a new political and economic system in the world. On one hand, America wanted to build the world's economic system based on capitalism. On the other hand, the Soviet Union followed the communist ideology. No one would have imagined that this conflict between America and the Soviet Union would become the center stage of international politics in the future. After the Second World War, the conflict between communism and capitalism made international politics more interesting. Why is it so interesting? Because here comes NATO. America wanted to reduce the influence of the Soviet Union. To make it possible, America and some of its supportive countries created NATO. Interesting, right? But did NATO succeed in its motive, which is to reduce the influence of the Soviet Union? What is the role of NATO on the world stage today? How NATO played an essential role in the war between America and the Soviet Union? You can find all the answers to these questions in this special series, History of NATO versus Russia. NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is an organization of 30 countries present around the North Atlantic Ocean. According to the official definition of NATO, the reason behind forming such an organization is that after the Second World War, the countries on both sides of the North Atlantic Ocean could develop a better relationship and help each other. Now, you might have some questions like which countries are on either side of the North Atlantic Ocean. On one side of the North Atlantic Ocean are America and Canada, while on the other side are European countries like England and France. But to understand NATO, there is some more information that you need to know. To know about the world's most powerful military organization, it is necessary to start with the Second World War. When the Second World War was about to end, Europe's economic and political situation worsened. A big reason for this was that a large part of the Second World War happened in Europe. Do you know which countries were ruined the most after the Second World War? Yes, Germany and Italy. But what about the countries who won the war? The European countries such as England and France who won the war did not fare much differently from the other countries. The Second World War, which lasted for almost 6 years, weakened the European countries. Britain and France no longer remained the world's biggest superpowers. When the Second World War ended, they were replaced by the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union and the United States also participated in the Second World War. This was the rise of the two biggest superpowers in the world, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. Even though America and the Soviet Union were together and fighting against countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan, as soon as the Second World War ended, conflicts started to develop between these two countries. The biggest reason behind this conflict was that the ideologies followed by these two countries were different and opposite. After the end of the Second World War, America and the Soviet Union became the two superpowers of the world. They wanted to increase their power and influence all over the world. They both wanted to spread their respective ideologies to increase their influence in the world. America was trying to influence other countries with its capitalist ideology. In contrast, the Soviet Union wanted to control as many countries as possible with their communist ideology. America and the Soviet Union took it as a chance to increase their influence in the newly developing world. After the Second World War, colonialism was rapidly ending. The world's geography was changing, and new countries were being formed on the world map. So, the race between the US and the Soviet Union to spread their ideologies also gained momentum. But spreading their ideologies to other countries was not only a challenge for both the countries. Another challenge was that they should ensure the safety of countries following their ideologies. Now you may have a question, why do they need protection after all? Let me explain this with an example. Suppose that many countries accepted capitalist ideology under the influence of America. Most countries that decided to adopt capitalist ideology were geographically close to the Soviet Union. Here comes the importance of safety. When a government near the Soviet Union tries to follow its opposite ideology, the Soviet Union will consider it a challenge and try to suppress that country. So, America must know the need for the safety of those countries that follow capitalism. So not only America had to provide the safety of the capitalist countries, but in the same way, the Soviet Union also had to provide the safety of those communist countries. For example, countries like Cuba, which follow a communist ideology, are near America. There is a constant threat from America to these countries. So the safety of these countries had also become the responsibility of the Soviet Union. The war between communism and capitalism divided the world into two parts. On the one side, the Soviet Union followed its communist ideology, while on the other, America tried to spread its capitalist ideology worldwide. This war between communism and capitalism was going to become the biggest reason for the Cold War and the formation of NATO. Let's move to the next episode where we will talk about the foundation of NATO. We learned in the last episode that the whole of Europe was economically and politically ruined because of the Second World War. Almost all the European countries were weakened, especially the old powerful countries. Europe's loss was a direct benefit for America and Russia, and they became the world's new superpowers. America followed capitalist ideology and Russia used to promote communist ideology. Both the countries wanted to increase their influence on the world through their ideologies. Let us learn how this war between two ideologies became the reason for the foundation of NATO. Since the end of the Second World War in 1945, America and Britain feared that the Soviet Union would use their power to establish a communist government in Eastern Europe. And in 1948, this fear of America and Britain seemed to change into reality. In February 1948, the Czechoslovak Communist Party took control of the Czechoslovak government. So it was evident that the Czechoslovak Communist Party would get complete support from the Soviet Union. As a result, the Czechoslovak Communist Party could remove the current government there with the help of the Soviet Union. After this, in 1948, the government of Finland signed an agreement with Moscow on which the Soviet Union took responsibility for the complete security and defense. After this agreement, Finland was free to make its own domestic decisions. And in 1948, the government of Norway informed British officials that they were being forced to sign an agreement as Finland did with Moscow. Britain knew if the Soviet Union could convince the Norwegian government to sign such an agreement, Sweden and Denmark would also decide to move with Norway. America and Britain were capitalist countries, and at the same time, after the Second World War, both countries together treated the communist government of the Soviet Union as the Nazi government of Hitler. America and Britain believed that, just as Hitler occupied Germany, the Soviet Union wanted to take over Europe. In 1946, US President Harry S. Truman stated that the communist government of the Soviet Union was no different from Hitler's Nazi government. Not just that, he also noted that the way the Soviet Union created a communist government in Czechoslovakia was just the same as Hitler's occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1938. And he called Stalin the dictator of the Soviet Union, just like Hitler was the dictator of Germany. After this, America and Britain began to understand that the way the Soviet Union took control over other countries, a situation like Hitler's Nazi Germany might arise again. At the same time, Britain tried to stop the increased advances of the Soviet Union in Western Europe. Britain believed that if America helped the countries of Western Europe to stand firmly against the Soviet Union would think twice before taking any major step. Britain was rapidly developing a plan to stop the Soviet Union from moving toward Western Europe. So Britain presented an agreement in 1948. In that agreement, Britain suggested that if Paris and London took part in a deal with Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg, they could act as a wall and stop the Soviet Union. Britain also believed that if all these countries would come together, then the Scandinavian countries, as well as Italy, Germany and Spain, could also be interested in the alliance of Western Europe. According to Britain, if they get America's support for this alliance, then the Soviet Union will not think about controlling Europe. As Britain wanted in 1948, France, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg signed the agreement. Under this agreement, Britain and other signatory countries agreed to form a defensive alliance and a joint military organization known as the Treaty of Brussels. Britain had already asked for help from America to support such an organization. In the US State Department, Congress presented a reservation in which the United States of America could join with this new alliance of Britain named the Brussels Pact. In 1948, as the Soviet Union's action became more aggressive, many meetings were happening under the Brussels Pact. In 1948, the Soviet Union began surrounding Berlin so that America, France and Britain could not reach the areas of Berlin that the Soviet Union held. Now, here is an interesting thing. When Germany lost the Second World War, the winning countries took Germany under their control. After this, Germany was divided into two parts. On one side was West Germany, occupied by America, Britain and France. On the other side was East Germany, which the Soviet Union occupied. The capital of Germany, Berlin, was also divided between the Soviet Union, Britain, France and the USA. But the Berlin city was situated in East Germany, which the Soviet Union occupied. In 1948, the Soviet Union surrounded Berlin so that the United States, France and Britain could not reach Berlin in any way. This worsened the situation between the Soviet Union and Western countries. Britain, America and their supportive countries decided that now they should stop this aggressive strategy of the Soviet Union. On the one hand, the Soviet Union was continuously increasing its influence on European countries, and on the other side, the presidential election was going to be held in America. Some Americans wanted America to stop the growing influence of communism and the Soviet Union in Europe. In contrast, others did not wish that America would risk their money and the army. But America's President Harry S. Truman soon realized that to stop the growing influence of communism and the Soviet Union in Europe, he would have to cooperate with the European countries. Since the end of the Second World War, America has been helping Europe economically under the Marshall Plan. But it was clear that only economic aid was not enough to save Europe from communism and the Soviet Union. In the last episode, we learned how the Marshall Plan of America was not enough to save Europe from the influence of the Soviet Union. Britain and France insisted that to save capitalist Europe from the Soviet Union, America should help by providing more military support to Europe along with economic backing. America was already facing many problems because of the aggressive strategy chosen by the Soviet Union in Berlin. To maintain the Soviet Union under control, America, Britain, France and the other countries of Western Europe agreed to one thing. They had to form a strong organization. By this time, presidential elections had been held in the US, and the issues regarding whether or not to give help to Europe had also been reduced to some extent. No wonder Harry S. Truman was elected as the President of America in 1948. From the beginning, Truman supported the making of the transatlantic organization that could prevent the growth of the Soviet Union and communism. Many political activists in America believed that if European countries were not strengthened against the Soviet Union, then America would suffer a lot politically and lose its international influence. On the other hand, the benefit of creating the Atlantic Pact is that it will strengthen Europe in defense and security. Not only that, it will help European countries to be politically strong enough to stand against the Soviet Union so that they would never have to fear the Soviet Union anymore. By then, America also got the public support to help Europe. So, the US government quickly started working on Britain's plan to create the Transatlantic Organization. After becoming the President of America in November 1948, Truman ordered the officers to start working quickly to create the organization as fast as possible. Because the elections in the US were over, the State Department had a lot of time to talk with the countries that would like to join the organization. But as soon as 1949 began, America had to put all the plans on hold. At the beginning of 1949, the US Secretary of State received news that some of the members of the US Senate House were not ready to agree on the treaty, and some of them wanted to discuss the plan prepared by the diplomats again. Most senators were unsure about the agreement on Article 5, which was the most important article in the NATO treaty. Article 5 is the principle that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all members who signed the treaty, and all the members together should take action against the country which attacked. American senators were not signing Article 5 of the NATO treaty because until then, the voting from US senators enabled America to take part in wars. But after signing this treaty, America would not need to wait for US senators' permission to participate in any of the wars with other countries. US senators asked to remove Article 5 from America's NATO treaty agreement. But Britain and other European countries strongly believed that Article 5 should be kept in the contract. At the same time, Canada had also joined this agreement, and Canada also thought that it was imperative to have Article 5 in this agreement because the real power of the agreement was hidden in this article. Article 5 of the NATO treaty also came into public discussion because the government had already informed the people about this organization through the media. So after that, if NATO had removed Article 5, it would have been considered a victory for the Soviet Union. And other countries also explained the same thing to the US senators. At least, they agreed to accept Article 5 with a few changes. Some changes were made to Article 5 to persuade US senators. One of the clauses was if any of the NATO countries were attacked, the government of those countries would be given the freedom to decide in what way they could respond to the attack. At last, on 4th of April 1949, all countries signed the NATO treaty. The NATO treaty was signed in Washington, so it was also known as the Washington Treaty. The first countries who signed the NATO treaty were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom and the United States of America. This treaty of April 1949 became an example of the unity of Western countries. And also, through this treaty, America has revealed its commitments to Europe in front of the world. Not only this was a signal to the Soviet Union that now the Soviet Union could not make any strategy against Europe considering it weak, and if it did, NATO would strongly respond. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was ready after the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. After signing the treaty, all the participant countries under this organization started preparing the structure of NATO and making a defense plan. But it was impossible to do it quickly because different countries under this organization had different opinions. France wanted some of the organization's military planners to stay permanently in Washington. On the other side, Britain wanted the planners to stay in London permanently. Everyone knew that France and Britain were competing to gain more importance in the organization, and they also knew that neither of the countries wanted the other to progress. During the initial days of NATO, both Americans and the British were already with the idea that NATO's military plans would be designed with a global strategy in mind. France also wanted to prepare NATO for a worldwide military strategy like America and Britain. France hoped they would also become equal partners in the military strategy of NATO with Britain and America. But Britain and America did not trust France at all, which is why both countries did not want France to be part of any strategy at the global level with them. Despite France's tremendous efforts, Britain and America stopped NATO from making a global military strategy and decided to limit within European issues. Britain and America were not only afraid of France but also both feared that if they prepared a global military strategy with NATO, it would destroy their relations with many countries on a global level. By the end of 1949, NATO set up its military committee. The army chiefs of every country under the organization were included in this NATO military committee. This military committee was divided into 5 parts, and these parts were given the responsibility of planning 5 different areas. Separate regions were created for the planning of Northwest and South Europe. Canada and the United States were also divided into different regions. A standing group was formed to cooperate with these different regions. Only the British and Americans were kept in this standing group to coordinate the military planning of different areas. From the beginning, America and Britain decided to do regional military planning in Europe, and France would be the only one who plans the work of NATO at the global level. On one hand, NATO was ready and planning for the future. On the other hand, the Soviet Union was moving towards making atomic bombs. NATO had not even prepared its structure yet. But what surprised the whole world was that the Soviet Union had completed the trial of their atomic bomb. So the treaty of NATO and the European countries was now even greater. The Soviet Union became the second country in the world to achieve atomic power after America. America was riding the high horse after successful nuclear trials. They didn't anticipate the Soviet Union to acquire the same power so soon. America had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the power of its atomic bomb, and the same atomic bomb was now in possession of the Soviet Union. This was very bad news for NATO and European countries. On June 15, 1950, Bernard Montgomery surveyed Europe's defenses after the Soviet Union got the atomic bomb. After that survey, Montgomery released the results, stating that if the Soviet Union attacked Western Europe had nothing to defend itself. He also said that the attack of the Soviet Union would destroy Western Europe. Before NATO could prepare its strategy for acquiring the atomic bomb of the Soviet Union, the war between North Korea and South Korea started. America went with the Korean War by leaving NATO's planning midway. NATO, as an organization, was still not fully ready. So, America did not trust them in the Korean War. At the same time, NATO countries did not want to use their military outside Europe. It became crucial for America to enter the Korean War. Why? Because the Soviet Union and China, the two prominent communist powers in the world, supported and helped North Korea. South Korea would also have come under the communist influence if America had not entered the Korean War. The Korean War did not have much effect on NATO's planning, but it stopped the planning of NATO. After the Korean War, NATO had a major concern about strengthening the defense of West European countries, so they could face it if the Soviet Union attacked them. Till now, America, Britain and the other NATO countries have been thinking about whether to include Germany in the defense planning of Western Europe or not. But as soon as the Soviet Union announced successful nuclear trials, NATO countries decided that they would have to include Germany in the planning of the defense of Western Europe. In 1950, Germany was divided into 2 parts. America, Britain and French soldiers were seen in the western part of the Germany, while the eastern part of Germany was under the control of the Soviet Union. When the Second World War ended, many of the allied countries of NATO wanted Germany not to be allowed to build up its army again. But by 1950, there was a big change in the thinking of America and many European countries. However, all the nations were also thinking that if Germany is given a chance to prepare its army again, then it can become a big threat to them once more. But by then, the Soviet Union had become powerful. So, if anyone could save Western Europe, it was only Germany. America, Britain, France and other European countries did not forget how Hitler started the Second World War by taking advantage of the people of Germany after the defeat in the First World War and the humiliation caused by that defeat. After the First World War, Germany's army was dissolved, and they were not allowed to build an army again. By breaking all the bans on Germany, Hitler raised his army again. In the end, the result was that the world had to face another war, due to which millions lost their lives. In the Second World War II, Germany had to face defeat. And now, America, Britain, and France feared that Germany would take revenge for their loss after raising their army again. But the situation in 1950 was quite different. To prevent the Soviet Union from moving towards Western Europe, it was necessary to give an army to Germany because Germany was the only country that could act as a border between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. America, Britain, and Western European countries discussed permitting Germany to form an army again. However, John McCloy, the American High Commissioner in Germany, warned that if Germany was given the freedom to create an army under German command, it would become a big problem for everyone. Continuing his point, he also said that if Germany is allowed to form an army under German command, they may cheat NATO by getting together with the Soviet Union. But John McCloy also offered a solution along with his warning. He said that all the European countries together should form a European army, and the command of that army should be in the hands of European countries. Then, this army could be used in Germany. By doing this, a strong army can be formed in Germany. At the same time, any threat from Germany can also be avoided. After that, American diplomats started thinking about forming the European army. Soon, they decided to create a new European army that would be joined by NATO and get complete support from America. By the end of 1950, a three-level plan was prepared. They decided to employ the people of Germany in the European army. A decision was taken to give the command of this European army to an American commander. In this way, America did not permit Germany to form any army of its own. But of course, the youngsters of Germany could join the European military. General Eisenhower, the well-known commander of America, was responsible for handling the European army working under the command of the newly created NATO. General Eisenhower was the one who performed well in leading the American military in Europe during the Second World War. After Eisenhower became the commander, a debate started in America on whether America should send its soldiers to Europe. But on the other hand, Britain and Canada had already decided to send their soldiers to Europe. After many debates, Americans also decided to send their soldiers. But General Eisenhower had already cleared that at the beginning itself, that America's soldier would be temporarily present in Europe. Eisenhower thought that within 3 years, the European army would completely stabilize Europe and the threat from the Soviet Union would also be over. And after that, there will be no need for American soldiers in Europe, and they can be sent back to America. Eisenhower was also thinking that within 3 to 4 years, Western European countries would also prepare a strong army of their own, which would be fully prepared to face any threat from the Soviet Union. But when General Eisenhower reached Europe, he saw that the situation in Europe's defense was much worse than he expected. Also, at the same time, the soldiers who came from America were not getting the respect and love they expected. Even after all these, General Eisenhower began planning to prepare the European army to fight against the Soviet Union. By viewing the increasing threat of nuclear attack from the Soviet Union, for once America was also ready to give its nuclear weapons to support NATO. But soon, America and its supportive countries realized that by introducing atomic weapons, they would not get any benefit. In fact, there would be an increasing threat of war from the Soviet Union. The Western European countries under NATO did know very well that if nuclear weapons were used in the fight between the Soviet Union and NATO, then the European continent would be the one that suffers the most significant loss. NATO decided to use Germany as a buffer zone to strengthen Western Europe. And in Germany, they started to increase the work of building the army. From 1950 to 1954, several meetings were held in Paris and Bonn. where they planned to prepare the European army. Most of the planning was based on the plan given by France. France had given the idea of creating a European Defense Committee. In this committee, a decision was taken to train Germany's military units and to make its different units. Apart from this, these units of Germany were also being planned to be used under the command of various divisions of NATO so that these units would never make any decisions on their own and together with each other to take any step against NATO. France proposed to form a European Defense Committee, and this notion was supported by both America and Britain. America, Britain and France did not want Germany to join NATO directly because they knew that by doing so, they could provoke the Soviet Union and would make the situation even worse. NATO could send its army to Germany only through the European Defense Committee. In 1953, Britain, France and America called a meeting in Bermuda. NATO's first secret general Lord Hastings Ismay was also there at this meeting. All those in the forum agreed that the European Defense Committee was the best way to include Germany in the European defense. The Republican Party leader and US diplomat John Foster Dulles, who attended the meeting, warned that if NATO were not successful in forming a European Defense Committee and ended up inviting Germany directly into NATO, it would be like committing suicide for the organization. Was NATO successful in creating the European Defense Committee or not? And did Germany become a part of NATO? Let's find the answers to all these questions in the next episode. Even after the warnings from John Foster Dulles and discussions of different levels, the National Assembly of France rejected the plan of European Defense Committee. At first, the plan was being prepared to include Germany indirectly into NATO by joining the European Defense Committee. But now, NATO had to change the plan. In 1954, all the member countries decided that Germany would be a part of NATO. On 23rd of October 1954, all the countries that signed the Brussels Treaty arrived in London for a meeting. Exactly 3 weeks later, the foreign ministers of Britain, France, Germany and America met in Paris. After these meetings in London and Paris, it was decided to make some changes to the North Atlantic Treaty. After these meetings, Britain, France and America also announced the removal of their occupation of West Germany. In 1954, West Germany became a completely free country with the name of the Federal Republic of Germany. Britain, France and America gave complete freedom to Germany, but they allowed the armies of their respective countries to remain in Germany in the same numbers as they were before. A big reason for this was that Germany did not have an army to protect its borders. The second reason was that by seeing the threat of the Soviet Union, West Germany wanted NATO and other Western countries to provide security. After completing all these formalities, the Federal Republic of Germany became a part of NATO by signing the North Atlantic Treaty in 1955. But the signing of West Germany to the North Atlantic Treaty was not a standard agreement. In the coming years, the Soviet Union was about to take a major step against West Germany joining NATO. The impact of this was visible in international politics in the coming years. Although NATO and Western European countries gave complete freedom to West Germany as the Federal Republic of Germany, they were still skeptical. NATO and Western European countries made such agreements with West Germany so that West Germany could not cheat them by raising its army or joining the Soviet Union in the coming years. First of all, NATO agreed with the Federal Republic of Germany, under which it was decided what kind of weapons Germany could make and how they could be used. At the same time, Konrad Adenauer, the German Chancellor, signed many such conditions, easing Western Europe's and NATO's countries' worries. One such condition was West Germany would never make atomic, biological or chemical weapons in Germany. By 1955, NATO had prepared a basic format of its own. Under the North Atlantic Treaty, Western European countries were connected to the United States. At the same time, while being a political organization, NATO was also handling the command of the European Army, which comprised soldiers from different countries. NATO became famous worldwide and was considered the symbol of power. NATO had established itself as an international institution, and had chosen its staff and secretary general. After Germany joined, NATO gave a new power to Western European countries against the Soviet Union. With this, NATO was firmly established to deal with any attack from the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union strengthened its strategies after West Germany joined NATO. Till now, Germany was the only divided between the East and West parts. But after West Germany joined NATO, the whole world would be divided into two parts. Why? To find out that, let's move on to the next episode. Under the Paris Agreement in 1954, NATO permitted West Germany to raise its army again. But, along with giving permission, many European countries began to see Germany as a threat to themselves when NATO helped West Germany to raise an army. Eastern European countries had a problem with raising their army against West Germany. East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Poland were the countries standing against the army of West Germany. These three countries protested against giving military power to West Germany. The Eastern European countries also had the same fear that the Western European countries had, that by raising their army, Germany would again try to get revenge for its defeat in the World War. Along with East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union also had a problem with West Germany raising an army. Not just that, the Soviet Union was already under pressure from NATO. But when NATO made West Germany a member of the organization and started to enlarge the group, the Soviet Union understood that it was the right time to respond to NATO by setting up a competing organization. Taking advantage of fears from East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union proposed to form a new organization to stand against NATO. In a move against West Germany joining NATO, the Soviet Union signed the Warsaw Treaty on May 14, 1955, along with the 7 countries of Eastern Europe, forming a union of sorts in the process. After signing the Warsaw Treaty, an organization named Warsaw Pact was formed under the leadership of the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Treaty got its name because of this treaty was signed in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. The Warsaw Treaty was officially known as the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance. From the beginning, the Soviet Union was trying to balance the ever-increasing power of NATO. But in 1955, after NATO permitted West Germany to set up its army and also gave its membership in the organization, the Soviet Union also got a chance to form an alliance of its own. The Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania acted as the founding members of the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union also allowed East Germany to raise its army in response to the army of West Germany. East Germany started preparing the National People's Army with the help of the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries. The Warsaw Treaty Organization was divided into 2 parts. One part was the Political Consultative Committee, which handled political matters, and the second part was known as the Combined Command of Pact Armed Forces, which looked into the issues related to the combined forces of all the countries associated with the organization. Its headquarters was built in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. From the outside, the security alliance of the Warsaw Pact was just the same as that of NATO. All the 8 countries included in the Warsaw Pact had taken an oath that if there were any attack on any one member of country, all the countries would provide help and support. But while signing the treaty, all the countries had also discussed that no government would interfere in each other's internal matters, and all nations would be free to make their political decisions. So how was Warsaw Pact different from NATO? First of all, in the Warsaw Pact, everything was under the control of the Soviet Union. And beyond that, the opinion of any other member country was not considered. Another critical clause was all commanding officers in the United Army of the Warsaw Pact would be selected from among the senior officers of the Soviet Union Army. Also, there was no fixed time for the retirement of the commanders assigned from the Soviet Army, and they could remain in their positions for a long time. On the other hand, all the countries in NATO got a chance to choose their commander after every term, and it was also decided in advance which commander would stay in his position for how long. Yes, America's influence in NATO was indeed very strong, but even then, the opinion of every member of the North Atlantic Alliance was considered for every decision taken through the meeting of the North Atlantic Council. One of the big reasons behind the formation of Warsaw Pact was that the Soviet Union did not want the Central and Eastern European countries to be manipulated to attack the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not want any other country to be used against the Soviets itself, like the way NATO used West Germany. With the help of Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union joined with all the Eastern and Central European countries east of West Germany and tried to form an organization to compete with NATO. The Warsaw Pact and NATO divided the world into two parts. On one hand, the Warsaw Pact, under the leadership of the Soviet Union, was known as the Eastern Bloc. On the other hand, under America's leadership, NATO became a powerful symbol of the Western Bloc. On one side, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were waving the flag of communism to the world, while on the other, America and its allies stood in support of the capitalist ideology. The difference between the Soviet Union and America divided the world into two parts. The differences between the US-led NATO and the Soviet Union were now visible to the world. But how did these differences between the two countries lead to animosity? We will find out in our next episode. After the Second World War, one thing became clear. If any nation were to challenge America's might in the future, it would be the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union acquired atomic power in 1949, it became a superpower along with the US. Both the countries wanted to increase their power and influence and spread their ideologies to more and more countries around the globe. For this reason, both countries would often be at odds with each other, but both knew very well that there would be great destruction in the world if a war happened between them. A big reason for this was that both countries had atomic weapons, but neither of them wanted to fall into any such situation where they had to use their nuclear weapons. When both nations could not compete, they started making indirect strategies against each other. And the result of this was the Cold War. The Cold War started between the US and the Soviet Union after the Second World War, in which they never directly fought with each other. Both countries tried to beat each other through their respective strategies, but never put their armies forward to fight each other directly. But there were several instances when the armies of these two countries came face to face, not on their land but in another country. NATO also made a significant contribution to preventing direct face-to-face contact between the US and the Soviet Union. 1962 proved to be the most dangerous year of the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. After taking over the government of Cuba in 1959, Cuban President Fidel Castro aligned himself with the government of the Soviet Union. The communist ideology influenced Fidel Castro from the beginning, and after removing the power of his country's government, he decided to form a communist government in Cuba. At the same time, the Soviet Union also provided economic help to Fidel Castro's government in Cuba. Along with this, the Soviet Union gave the necessary technologies to make Cuba's army powerful. The Soviet Union wanted to make Cuba a strong communist country. Cuba was close to the US and became important to the Soviet Union's strategy. On the other hand, America did not want any strong communist country near them at all. In 1962, in response to increasing pressure from the US and Cuba, the Soviet Union installed nuclear missile launch pads on Cuban soil. There was another big reason behind this. America had already set up its nuclear missiles on the land of allies of NATO countries like Greece and Turkey. These missiles could target the capital of Russia, and Moscow constantly felt surrounded by these missiles. By setting nuclear missiles in Cuba, Moscow wanted to put America under the same pressure they were facing. The missiles the Soviet Union had set in Cuba were at a distance of only 90 miles from America. When US President John F. Kennedy learned that the Soviet Union's nuclear missile had reached so close to America, he decided to declare war if the Soviet Union did not remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba soon. The relations between the USA and the Soviet Union had become very bad, and the world had reached very close to nuclear war. But in the end, many big countries came forward and made settlements between these two superpowers. NATO countries also played an essential role in this settlement. In the agreement between Russian President Nikita Khrushchev and US President John F. Kennedy, America decided to remove the nuclear missiles in NATO countries near Russia. In response, Nikita Khrushchev also announced the removal of Russia's nuclear missiles from Cuba. Many historians believe that the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was a turning point in modern history. The Cuban Missile Crisis had left a significant impact on world politics, but at the same time it was the reason for many major changes in NATO. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world understood that America had overtaken the rest of the countries in terms of military power. NATO countries also understood this very well, especially France and Britain were beginning to realize that America had gone much ahead of them. Britain was ready to accept America as a complete leader in NATO. But French President Charles de Gaulle wanted to keep his army and French position in NATO under his control. Charles de Gaulle did not wish for America or any other country to maintain its influence on the French army. But as the structure of NATO's military command was prepared, Charles de Gaulle could not get complete control of the French army. French President's problems regarding NATO were not limited to just the control over the military. He also didn't want any foreign army in France, but due to being a member of NATO, not just the military of NATO but also the military of other member countries of NATO could also remain in France. And this made Charles de Gaulle very unhappy. You might wonder what happened after the Cuban crisis of 1962 that made the French president resentful and uncomfortable with France's position in NATO. Charles de Gaulle was the president of France since 1959, and before that, until 1958, he had also been the Prime Minister of France. It is believed that Charles de Gaulle realized after the Cuban crisis of 1962 there won't be a war between the Soviet Union and the United States of America ever, because both countries had nuclear weapons and knew that a war against each other would destroy the nations and the rest of the world. Not only this, but Charles de Gaulle also believed that if two countries have nuclear power, then fighting with each other with this power is not at all beneficial to either of them in any way. This is why no country wants to use nuclear power to fight. They only use it to show their power and to increase their influence on other countries so that they don't try to attack those countries with nuclear power. In 1960, under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle, France made the necessary arrangements to make nuclear weapons. So after Britain, America and the Soviet Union, France became the fourth country in the world to have nuclear power. In the Cuban crisis of 1962, Charles de Gaulle saw how the Soviet Union agreed to back down from the fear of America's nuclear weapons, nor they took any risk of direct attack. Charles de Gaulle felt that after becoming a nuclear power, France did not need any alliance for security from the Soviet Union. In such a situation, why should he allow the army of other countries to stay in his country if it's not benefiting France in any way? He also thought if his own army was powerful, why should he work under the leadership of other countries? But France had already signed the NATO treaty, and according to the treaty, France should give a part of its army to work under the leadership of NATO. At the same time, France could not even stop the army of NATO from coming to its land. Before becoming the president of France, Charles de Gaulle was the commander of the French army in the Second World War. So, he gave much importance to the army. France also did the first successful trial of nuclear weapons under the army's leadership. Charles de Gaulle did not like to see the control of any external organization or country on the French military and the land of France. That's why Charles de Gaulle quickly decided that France would exit from NATO membership so that it could not be forced to give its army and land to NATO. Charles de Gaulle had been thinking of leaving NATO since 1962. But Britain and other members of NATO were trying to convince Charles de Gaulle that if France left NATO membership, it would pass a very wrong message to the world, and people would understand that there was no unity among Western European countries. At the same time, Britain reminded France that if they exited from NATO membership, it would violate the Brussels Treaty of 1954. But these things did not have much effect on Charles de Gaulle, and finally, in 1966, Charles de Gaulle announced that France was separating itself from NATO's military command. That is, France refused to be directly associated with NATO in any matter related to the military. After separating from the military command of NATO, France called back all of its soldiers working in NATO and ordered all the armies of NATO countries in France to leave the country. When France resigned from NATO membership, there were discussions in international politics that everything was not going well inside NATO, and NATO had become a victim of infighting. Many people also believed that as an organization, NATO would be dissolved in a few years. But Britain knew that as long as NATO existed, Western European countries would always be one step ahead of the Soviet Union. For this reason, Britain did not want NATO to be disbanded. When France began to withdraw its army from NATO, Britain felt it would need a lot of money and soldiers to make up for the shortfall of the French army. At the same time, the rest of the NATO members started to have a fallout, so Britain had to handle that too. Britain took the responsibility of correcting the situation on both sides. It made efforts to strengthen unity among NATO members again, especially. America got irritated with the fact that France was leaving NATO, but at the same time, America did not want to spoil its relations with France in any way because, at that time, America was at war with Vietnam. And NATO members of Europe also did not want America to take any action against France. In the end, after meeting among themselves, member countries of NATO decided to accept France as just a political member. And with that, NATO gave the option to France that whenever they wanted, they could rejoin the military command of NATO. When France left NATO in 1966, it showed NATO as a weakening force, and we would think that it should have been a happy occasion for the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union did not even get a chance to celebrate because the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, was getting mixed up with problems of its own. The biggest challenge before the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was not coming from any foreign country, nor was NATO trying to damage the Warsaw Pact directly. The most significant cause of trouble for the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was their fellow member of the Warsaw Pact, Albania. When the Warsaw Pact was formed in 1954, Albania was one of the founding members. But only in a few short years, Albania started accusing the Soviet Union of deviating from the ideology of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. Actually, Albania had become a communist country since the Second World War. Even Hoxha, who ran the government in Albania, and his Party of Labour of Albania wanted to run his government as Stalin did, in which more emphasis was given to the country's unity and self-reliance or self-sufficiency. Now let me tell you a very interesting fact related to Albania. Albania was the first country in the world that refused to follow any religion and declared itself an atheist state. Atheists are people who do not believe in the existence of God. Albania was important to the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. The strategic importance of Albania being close to Italy and near the Mediterranean Sea made it a vital partner for the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union and the member countries of the Warsaw Pact did not want to ruin their relations with Albania. The government of Albania was heavily influenced by the ideas of the Soviet Communist government and Joseph Stalin, the second president of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was an ideal for the government of Albania, which was why the relations between the Soviet Union and the Albania were very strong during Stalin's time. Joseph Stalin died in 1953. In his place, Nikita Khrushchev took the mantle of the president of the Soviet Union. But Nikita Khrushchev was quite different from Stalin. He also believed in communism, but did not strictly follow this ideology like Joseph Stalin. After the death of Joseph Stalin, the distance between the leaders of Albania and the Soviet Union began to increase, due to which problems arose in the relations between the two countries. Albania said that the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, was not following the ideology Joseph Stalin had prepared for the nation. At this time, Albania's relation with China began to improve. and Albania began to associate itself more with China's communist ideology. The Soviet Union did not like Albania's growing relations with China because China and the Soviet Union had a hostile relationship in the past. At last, in 1961, the Soviet Union ended all its relations with Albania and called back its army from Albania. It also asked Albania to call back its ambassadors from Moscow and vacate its embassy. But Albania at that time did not want to end its relation with the Soviet Union completely. As a founding member of the Warsaw Pact, Albania connected with the organization, but the Soviet Union did not allow Albania to be part of the organization's decision-making process in any way. In 1968, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact decided to attack Czechoslovakia as the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was steadily weakening and there was a quick movement for liberalization. So, 4 members of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, Hungary, Bulgaria and Poland, attacked Czechoslovakia to save the ruling Communist Party. Albania protested against this attack from the Soviet government and the Warsaw Pact. Apart from Albania, Romania was also against the violent and radical decisions of the Warsaw Pact. Both countries said that the Warsaw Pact was formed to strengthen the defenses of the communist countries, not to attack other countries. But in the Warsaw Pact, no member's opinion was considered by the Soviet Union, as it was the Soviet Union who had decided to attack Czechoslovakia. The other member countries could not have gone against it. Albania got itself out of the membership of the Warsaw Pact by protesting against the Warsaw Pact's attack on Czechoslovakia. Romania did not separate itself from the Warsaw Pact, but it did participate in any way in the attack on Czechoslovakia. So, if Czechoslovakia wanted to bring democracy into its system, open the border of its country to other countries, and follow the policy of liberalization, then why didn't America and NATO come forward to give them any security from the Warsaw Pact? The reason behind this is quite interesting. Let's move to the next episode to learn more. On the night of 20th and 21st of August, under the leadership of the Soviet Union, 3 more member countries of the Warsaw Pact attacked Czechoslovakia with about 250 lakh soldiers. Czechoslovakia was still now under the supervision of a communist government. But things changed and they started thinking about liberalization and opening the country's border for trade. Along with these trade reforms, Czechoslovakia seemed to be moving towards a capitalist society. This revolution in Eastern Europe, which was still under communist ideology, was a matter of great concern for the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia was also part of the Warsaw Pact, so it was even more worrying that it was going against the communist ideology. As a result, the Soviet Union and 4 other countries attacked Czechoslovakia. We already knew why the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact attacked Czechoslovakia. But now, the question arises why NATO or America didn't help Czechoslovakia, which was trying to move towards capitalist ideology. The biggest reason behind this was the situation with America. The USA was already involved in the Vietnam War and had sent a large part of its army to Vietnam. Because of the Vietnam War, more than half of America's population had already turned against the government. They were angry that American soldiers were losing their lives due to war in other countries, and taxpayers' money was being used to buy weapons and other items used in combat. The Vietnam War and the people of America being against the war were the reason that the US did not want to take risks engaging in another war. When the US refused to interfere in Czechoslovakia, the rest of the NATO countries also decided not to go to war against Soviet Union. They knew very well that their power would be greater than the Soviet Union only when America stood with them. No NATO countries wanted to take the risk of fighting against the Soviet Union without America. Another reason was the fear of nuclear war, which prevented NATO from going against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Apart from America, Britain was the only country in NATO with nuclear weapons. Apart from this, the military power of NATO countries had also increased significantly in the last few years, due to which they were not as weak as before. For once, NATO countries could have thought of a war against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, but then they also knew very well that the danger would increase further by using nuclear weapons in such a war. Even if nuclear weapons were not used, the battle between the Warsaw Pact and NATO could have ruined Europe. The Western leaders feared that all the progress that Europe had made after the Second World War could be ruined, and Europe's political and economic conditions might worsen again. Overall, it can be said that if NATO had entered the Battle of Czechoslovakia, it could have started the Third World War. Europe, which had already suffered two significant wars in the 20th century, did not want to be part of another. In the end, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union did not face each other in the War of Czechoslovakia. After winning the Second World War, the Allied forces of the three countries decided not to interfere in each other's territories in Yalta and Potsdam. However, in the year 2000, the UK Public Record Office released some documents which showed that NATO was preparing to respond to the attack on Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact. The report mentioned that Washington and London were thinking of taking military action against the Soviet Union because they felt that if the Soviet Union increased its influence through such attacks, the alliance of NATO could be in danger. NATO's biggest tension was that if the Soviet Union had moved toward Albania and Italy after occupying Czechoslovakia, NATO might have moved into war against the forces of the Warsaw Pact. But this tension of NATO could not turn into reality because the Soviet Union, with its members of the Warsaw Pact, went as far as Czechoslovakia and never tried to go beyond it. Other reports from the Public Record Office also stated that the Soviet Union knew, with the help of a secret service, that if the Warsaw Pact's army went beyond Czechoslovakia, that is, towards Albania and Italy, NATO would attack. After receiving this information, the army of the Warsaw Pact did not try to make any plans to go beyond Czechoslovakia. The mission Czechoslovakia of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was successful as they did not face any problem from NATO. But this move of the Soviet Union against Czechoslovakia proved very harmful to the Warsaw Pact. So, how did the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact suffer? Let's go to the next episode to learn more about this. The attack on Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union and the member countries of the Warsaw Pact in 1968 weakened the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. Following the attack on Czechoslovakia, the member countries started acting hostile to each other. Albania and Romania openly spoke against the Warsaw Pact's invasion of Czechoslovakia. Albania and Romania also refused to cooperate with the Warsaw Pact in the attack on Czechoslovakia. Albania even exited from membership and ended all relations with the Warsaw Pact. On the other hand, Romania did not leave the Warsaw Pact but refused to help the united army formed to attack Czechoslovakia. Because of this, the Warsaw Pact was divided entirely. Not just that, the member countries of the Warsaw Pact no longer trusted each other. Czechoslovakia itself was a member of the Warsaw Pact. Due to this action of the Warsaw Pact, a wrong message was sent to the rest of the members, and they felt that they might have to face a similar situation one day, like the attack on Czechoslovakia. Even after a successful mission in Czechoslovakia, it proved very harmful to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. The attack on Czechoslovakia broke the Warsaw Pact, and an important country like Albania exited from the organization. After Albania, a critical member left in 1968. The Warsaw Pact weakened as an organization. It kind of marked the beginning of the end of the Warsaw Pact, but it was not the only reason. The most significant power of the Warsaw Pact was the Soviet Union, which was this organization's unofficial leader. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Warsaw Pact weakened because of the Soviet Union was also becoming increasingly strained as a country. There was no direct war between the Soviet Union and NATO so far, but the Soviet Union had been fighting indirectly with the NATO countries through the war in different countries. The Korean War where America supported South Korea while the Soviet Union supported North Korea, is a great example. The Soviet Union was weakening and the power of NATO and America was increasing continuously. Even though America had to face defeat in the Vietnam War, America's economy was still much stronger than the Soviet Union. Not only America, NATO countries like Britain, West Germany, and France were also making better progress than the Soviet Union in terms of economy. The communist economic model of the Soviet Union was not giving the profit it needed. Even though the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact weakened compared to the NATO countries after the Czechoslovakia mission, they still had enough capability to compete with the US and NATO. The Soviet Union's mission in Afghanistan proved to be the last nail in the coffin. In 1978, there was a centralist government in Afghanistan led by Mohammad Dawood Khan. This government also had the support of America, but in 1978, influenced by communist ideology, the army officers under the leadership of Nur Muhammad defeated Dawood Khan's government. After this, the communist government came to Afghanistan. This is where a civil war started in Afghanistan, where Islamic groups started protesting against Nur Muhammad's communist government. After this, America and NATO countries began giving weapons to Islamic groups protesting against the communist government of Afghanistan. The groups fighting against the communal government of Afghanistan were known as the Mujahideen. When America started giving weapons to the Mujahideen, the communist government of Afghanistan was unsuccessful in controlling them. In 1979, the Soviet Union began supporting the communist government of Afghanistan against the Mujahideen supported by America. At first, the Soviet Union tried to control Mujahideen without sending its army to Afghanistan, but it did not help much as America gave weapons with modern technology to the Mujahideen. Then, the Soviet Union decided to send its army to Afghanistan. The US and NATO supported Mujahideen now had weapons with modern technology. So the Soviet Union had more difficulty in controlling them than they expected. The Soviet Union also sent 30,000 soldiers of its army and a large number of tanks and other weapons to Afghanistan. The Soviets had to spend a lot sending their army to fight in other countries. And as a result, their defense budget was increasing continuously. Their economy was also not growing fast enough that they could control their growing defense budget. The US and NATO were not directly included in the war in Afghanistan, but they engaged the Soviet Union indirectly through the Mujahideen. The Soviet Union expected that in a few years after ending the war in Afghanistan, they would call back their soldiers. But the mission of Afghanistan proved to be more complicated than they expected. The Mujahideen, backed by NATO and America, fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan for 10 continuous years. And finally, in 1989, the economic situation of the Soviet Union became so bad that it could no longer afford for its army to fight in Afghanistan. That is why the Soviet Union decided to call back its army from Afghanistan. At the same time, the Mujahideen, supported by the US and NATO, were still active in Afghanistan, and they did not allow the Soviet Union's mission in Afghanistan to be successful. Thus, the Soviet Union's fight against NATO, America, and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan proved to be very harmful to them. Within a year of the end of the war with Afghanistan, the Soviet Union broke up and split into 15 countries. This paved the way for Russia to take its place in international politics. On December 26, 1991, 15 new countries appeared on the world map. The world's largest country, the Soviet Union, which stood against NATO and America, was removed entirely from the world map. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia took the responsibility of keeping the communist ideology alive. Even though the Soviet Union was not officially on the world map, its ideology spread worldwide. NATO and America had become much more powerful than communist countries, and Russia was not ready to go to war with NATO and America. From 1990 to 2000, NATO and the US had an influence on most countries. During this time, Russia did not interfere much in international politics. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, NATO openly used its army in Europe in 1995 for the first time, which was in Bosnia-Herzegovina. After the breakup of the Soviet Union and the weakening of Russia, the US and NATO were openly taking action in Europe. After using its army in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1995, NATO then used its army in Kosovo in 1999. NATO had not deployed its army directly even once in the first 45 years of its history. And the same NATO had now put its army in direct war twice. That too, within 10 years of the breakup of the Soviet Union. However, Russia also supported the mission that NATO started in Kosovo. After the completion of the Kosovo mission, Russia hoped that it would also get an area of Kosovo for peacekeeping, but the US and NATO countries did not allow Russia to be part of peacekeeping in Kosovo in any way. For Russia, this was like being stabbed in the back, but it was not strong enough to take any action against NATO and America. These few years were humiliating for the leaders of Russia, where he had to kneel to the US and NATO several times at the international level. America was continuously increasing its influence in Europe and was making new countries members of NATO. But in the year 2000, Vladimir Putin became the president of Russia. And from then, the situation in Russia started to change. Putin wanted to get back the lost power of the Soviet Union and put Russia as the world superpower in front of America. Vladimir Putin began to develop Russia's army. He increased its power over the years to such an extent that Russia was considered an influential country ahead of the United States. Soon, Russia presented itself as a challenger in international politics at every opportunity in front of America. Under Putin's leadership, Russia also improved its international relations and image in front of the world. Russia made a lot of progress, not only at the military level but also at the economic level, so it could sustain its hefty defense budget. Today, we can see how Russia has regained its old status under Putin's leadership. We are getting examples of this in Syria, Iran, and at this time in Ukraine, where Russia stood firmly against NATO. The fighting between NATO and Russia, which has been going on for almost 70 years, has become the reason for many wars worldwide. But the fight between NATO and Russia also kept the balance of power between both, due to which NATO or Russia couldn't do anything that could cause a global catastrophe. After America acquired nuclear weapons in 1945, a great danger arose in front of the world because no country had the power equal to America. In such a situation, if America and NATO were angry with any country, or if they found the actions of any government against them, then they could openly take action against it, and no one would be in a position to stop them. But when the Soviet Union came, such a situation did not arise. Even though the world was divided into two parts and a Cold War started, in the midst of all this, the balance of power did not change. NATO and Russia also did many such things together, which could stop major wars in the world. The most critical task was to eliminate nuclear weapons from spreading worldwide.